Hey YouTube, this is tcgsam here, and in today's video I'm going to be going over how as a competitive player you can approach a new format. In this first part of the series I'm going to be talking about how to actually pick the best deck for you, because that may or may not be the actual best deck of the format. I'm going to be giving a bit of context into why I'm doing these videos and like what to expect from them, so if you don't care about that, just want to see the video right away, then you can skip ahead to the timestamp on the screen or use the chapters below. But for some context, first off, this video is supposed to help anytime that we have a new format. At the time of recording, it is the Blazing Dominion format after we got our recent ban list, so I'll be using decks from that, but hopefully you can take what you see here and apply it to any format you see in the future. Second off, this is just going to be the process that I personally use. May or may not be the optimal process and may or may not be perfect for you, but I hope that you can at least get something useful out of this. Maybe it'll show you some things that you can consider whenever you take the first step into a new format, and that being choosing a deck. And then finally, hopefully in this series, I'll be able to go over things like the start of the format where you choose the deck that's right for you, all the way to the end where you're getting proper testing for that deck. Alright, so without any further ado, let's hop straight into the video. The first thing I always do at the start of a new format before I choose the deck that I want to play is just take a look at the top 10 decks of the format. It may not always be possible at the start of a format since we won't have any results yet, but at the time of recording, we've just had YCS Columbus. And in my personal opinion, these decks that you see here are what I feel to be the top 10 best decks of the format. And then these decks down here that are maybe some more like roguish options, but are still some things that you may want to consider. So after looking at what the best decks are, I'll start all of it off by just very quickly going over the general playstyles of each of the decks and seeing which one is the one that resonates most with me. So with a deck like Cool Tune's pretty mid-rangey, even though you have full hand knowledge of your opponent, it can still be hard to navigate some game states, especially if both players know what they're doing. Doomsday is one of those like typical combo decks where if you set up your end board, you should be able to win. Branded's one of those like mid-rangey decks, has a very good strong grind game. Malice, also one of those like super big combo decks, but it is able to play a very high count of non-engine. Fairy Tail's pretty mid-rangey. You can also build it to be more combo focused, just adding in more engines. Sky Striker, pretty typical control / mid-rangey deck. Mitsurugi, like there are a couple different variants of this. Like maybe if you're into something that has a little bit more flexibility, you want to have like multiple different engines in your deck, Mitsurugi could be the deck for you. Radiant Typhoon I think is also like mid-rangey / control style deck. I'll say this one's maybe a bit of a more specific meta call. It has good matchups with certain decks, but especially with the recent ban list, probably not as strong as it was before. Power Patron, also one of those big combo decks like Doomsday, where if it gets the combo, it's probably winning the game. Power Patron, similar idea, except its engine is also pretty solid at going second. So once I've gone over like the very high level playstyles of each of these decks, I'll kind of take a look at the ones that really stand out to me, which I think matches with my playstyle the best. And I personally think this is the most important thing to consider, because I'm someone who believes that you should always be playing a deck you're the most comfortable with, even if it isn't necessarily the absolute best choice. Just because, well, even if you take the best deck, if you're not familiar with it or not good enough with it, it doesn't really matter. You probably will have a better chance of doing better with a deck that may not be the absolute best deck, but is more suitable to your playstyle. So for me personally, playing Cool Tune is not necessarily my playstyle, so I'm taking a look at decks like Doomsday and Branded, which I personally think are the next best decks of the format, at least representation and results, and in terms of matching my own playstyle. So this next step of the process, I'll take a slightly deeper dive into both of these decks, and I'll go over both as sort of an example that maybe you can choose to follow, or just to give you a better idea of how the rest of the process may look like. So the first thing I'm going to do after picking out decks that I think are more suitable for me, I'm going to very quickly look at how they potentially match up into the other best decks of the format. So a deck like Doomsday, for example. Going first, of course, its end board is pretty much never going to be broken by too many decks, except for maybe decks with like many breakers. So maybe a deck like Sky Striker could break it when going second. Maybe a deck like Branded could break it too, since its interactions aren't necessarily best into that deck. But generally, overall, if I get to go first, if I set up my combo properly, I should be winning the game against most, if not all of these decks, most of the time. That kind of indicates to me that, okay, Doomsday fulfills like at least one condition of being potentially a good enough deck to play in this format. Now, at this point, if I notice, like for example, that even if I get to go first and pop off, like half of these decks could beat my deck, I probably wouldn't choose to play it. But in this case, since I think that it can do well into most of these other decks when going first, I think it's good enough. Now, evaluating this deck going second into all these decks, its engine is a little bit above average at breaking boards, courtesy of the Pendulum Monster. And so I want to ask myself, is my engine able to consistently keep up with the other decks of the format in terms of their engine? I'm not really going to consider non-engine here because, well, if your opponent has a full board and a bunch of non-engine, you're probably not winning that game no matter what deck you have. But in terms of engine to engine, let's say both players just have engine-only hands, like the player going first puts up their engine only board, and the player going second just has engine. Like, are they able to play fairly well into that? I would say Doomsday actually doesn't have too bad of a time into Cool Tune in terms of engine to engine. Cool Tune's interruptions do revolve a lot around destruction, and of course Doomsday is able to benefit from that. Maybe it'll struggle a little bit more into the branded interruptions because the branded interruptions will be cards like Mirror Jade banishing their monsters, which is pretty problematic for Doomsday. Similar with Malice. Malice has a lot of cards that banish as well, especially a card like MTP or Cryptor. They could banish the Pendulum skill, so it could be very problematic for the Doomsday matchup, so that's something you need to keep in mind. Fairy Tail, one of their main interruptions is constantly using Snow. That can be pretty annoying as well for Doomsday. Sky Striker, I think, is something that Doomsday is going to be okay against. Again, Sky Striker League 2 pops a card. Interruptions like Widow Anchor, they're solid, but not necessarily backbreaking. Mitsurugi, also similar to Cool Tune, their interruptions focus a lot on like destruction, so maybe Doomsday doesn't have that bad of a time into it. Radiant Typhoon, I think, kind of hit or miss, depends on what kind of end board that they end on. Doomsday's probably okay into that. And then Archmage and Power Patron, I don't really know if the engines of Doomsday is good enough to beat those decks and when they set up their full board, but then again, not many decks are able to do that. So after taking a look at Doomsday, I feel like overall, it's engine to engine compared to the other decks, not bad. There are a few matchups where like the engine is significantly worse than the other deck, like for example maybe against like Malice or Branded, but in general I would say Doomsday is probably above average in terms of being able to go second. So now at this point, once I've determined okay my deck is able to go first, should be winning most of those games, going second, if I draw some like non-engine on top of my engine, I should have a decent time into most of these decks. I think I'll conclude that this deck is probably good enough to take it to a tournament. I might have like 1 or 2 matchups that are a little bit worse for me, and in general my matchups against these other decks should be pretty neutral or even slightly favored for me. Now at this point, once I've determined that generally my deck should be okay into the other best decks of the format, I'll start taking a look at the non-engine that we have in the format, and specifically non-engine that is noteworthy, things that are a little bit different than the norm. So I won't really consider cards like Ash Blossom because like that's pretty much going to be in almost every single format. I'll mainly be considering cards that are interesting, that could be potentially problematic for the deck that I'm playing. So first thing I'm going to take a look at are hand traps, because those have been historically the main source of non-engine. And I think every format you go into, you do want to start by considering whether or not hand traps are going to be the dominant driving force, or if most decks are going to be playing. So in terms of the hand traps, of course, while Charmies are similar to Ash Blossom, are almost going to be in every single format that we have. So I want to ask myself, how does my deck generally fare into these? Against Molcharmy Fulos, I would say the Doomsday deck has like some options. They'll generally end on a Drastia as their half ward, and Drastia is quite a few interactions just on its own. So I think overall, its game plan into Fua is solid enough. Effect negators like Effect Veiler and Infinite Impermanence are starting to become more popular in this format because of a deck like Cool Tune that's able to jam so many of them into their deck. You also want to ask yourself if like these lower impact hand traps like Veiler are able to do well against your deck. Personally, I think that against Doomsday, these lower impact hand traps like Veiler are not necessarily that great. They're usable, of course, but I think Doomsday has enough tools to play around them. Now, something that could potentially be problematic is cards like Ogre and Harmonia, which have been gaining a lot of popularity because of Cool Tune. I think these could potentially be one red flag in my deck selection process, especially since the Doomsday game plan focuses so much on like ranking up their guys. Cards like Ogre and Harmonia that are going to be at like 6 copies in the Doomsday deck could make it so that matchup is a little bit more swung in their favor because these cards are just so good against Doomsday. But generally, at least with the Doomsday deck, I think you'll always be able to draw some hands that are able to play through even both of these at the same time. So I think while this could potentially be a problem, it's not something that's going to make me automatically take the deck out of consideration. And finally, maybe like the more niche hand traps like Bell. The cards like Bell are not necessarily super great against Doomsday, so I think it's okay. And now next up are the board breakers. In the Blazing Dominion format specifically, breakers have been getting a lot more popular since we are trying to beat Cool Tune with it. People have kind of realized that like, unless you're trying to like choke them out of being able to play at all, and your deck's able to play like 15 to 20 hand traps, it's probably better to play breakers. And now you want to ask yourself, how does your deck fare into these common board breakers? Let's say you're not playing against Cool Tune and you're playing against these other decks, which are not playing like 15 to 20 hand traps and are choosing to play breakers instead. Is your deck going to be able to beat those cards? The first main one we can talk about, like I said, is Super Poly. I think generally Doomsday has a pretty decent time to Super Poly. You can always play around it on your end board by making a card like Drastia early on. You never end on end board that should be able to be Super Polyed unless they put a monster on the board first. So against like maybe the best board breaker of the format, I think Doomsday is actually pretty solid. Forbidden Crown I think is also fairly popular. It can be kind of problematic, but I think because Doomsday is that type of combo deck where like they have so many other things on their end board, it's not necessarily always going to be a problem if they stop your Drastia. You could also kind of quote-unquote play around this card in Doomsday, so I don't think Forbidden Crown is too much of a problem either. Something that could potentially be interesting is Book of Eclipse, because once again, it is another card that beats Drastia. If your opponent is pairing Book of Eclipse with like other breakers or other hand traps, and you only end on let's say a Drastia, this card can be pretty problematic. But generally, if you do have your full end board, like it's going to trade 1-for-1 with your negates. So I think this is a card to watch out for, but not necessarily backbreaking for the deck. Now, something that could be backbreaking for the deck is if people start to play Dark Ruler no more. I would say this is probably Doomsday's like biggest weakness in terms of a board breaker, just because you don't really have any counterplay to it except with like non-engine like Solemn Accusation or Solemn Judgment. So if decks are very specifically teching this card, it can mean you may have to reconsider your deck choice, because if you just have a quote-unquote auto-lose card like this that everyone's playing, maybe it's time to switch to something else. Alright, so that would kind of wrap up the first part of the process and whenever I prepare for a new format in terms of choosing a deck. Just to summarize what we did with Doomsday, took a look at how it matches up into the other perceived best decks of the format, going first and going second, and how it matches up into the most common non-engine cards of the format overall. Like I said, I'm going to be doing this with the branded deck as well, so you can have one more example of how I'd approach this process. Alright, so for the second half of the video, I'm going to be doing the deck selection process that I go through every format for branded specifically, just so you guys can have another example of how to do this for other decks as well. So in terms of branded, I'm once again going to be taking a look at how its engine matches up into the engines of these other decks, both going first and going second at a very high level. Starting off against the Cool Tune deck, I would say branded is maybe one of those decks that could actually, engine to engine at least, keep up with Cool Tune, if not actually surpass it a little bit, because the interruptions that Cool Tune has, while they're pretty solid, their level modulation cards, for example, like back-to-back RS, their interruptions like Mix, Rico, not always going to be the highest impact against branded. I would almost venture to say that branded has its favored or slightly favored matchup engine to engine against the Cool Tune deck, which is probably a good sign for the deck. In terms of engine to engine against Doomsday, I would say this one's a little bit more of a coin toss. Depending on the hand of branded, sometimes it can be problematic to deal with the Doomsday interruptions, but other times, if the hand is good enough, the Doomsday engine is probably not going to be super threatening. So I would say this one's a little bit more 50-50. Against the Malice deck, I think it's also, in terms of just engine to engine at the very least, I would say Malice is decent against branded. Having banish removal against cards like Albion when you commit it onto the board, even card like Cartesia, banishing that and removing it from play, it can make the grind game of branded a lot worse, so this could potentially be a problem matchup. Against the Fairy Tail deck, just in terms of its engine interactions alone, maybe the only problematic interaction against this deck could be that they have their field spell that can change the names of the branded monsters into fairy prints, making it not fall on Valbaz anymore, which can be kind of problematic against the branded deck, so this was once again a potentially problematic matchup. Branded against Sky Striker, I think, is alright. I'll say both have very solid grind games, so this matchup is also kind of a 50-50, depends a little bit more on the player. Against Mitsurugi, I think branded has a fairly solid matchup. Mitsurugi interruptions aren't the greatest against the branded deck. Against Radiance, I think it's like slightly favored to 50-50 for branded. Once again, his interruptions are not necessarily the best against branded, but again, depends on the hands and the skill level of both players. Against the Archmage and the Power Patron decks, I think that generally, like engine to engine, it can be kind of hard for branded to keep up with like these very big combo decks at times if they aren't able to set up like their maximum board, if they aren't able to set up their maximum board. And so these matchups, once again, also kind of 50-50. And then generally against rogue decks, I don't think branded has any like significant problem against those as well. Branded interruptions are pretty solid, and branded is one of those decks with a good grind game, so if you play against like a random control deck, your deck is probably going to end up being better. So generally for branded, at a very quick glance, I think it actually matches up very well into the format, which I think is one of the reasons it's doing so well at the moment. It doesn't really have too many losing matchups, maybe has like one or two matchups where it's like slightly unfavored, but because of its slightly positive matchup into a deck like the perceived best deck of Cool Tune, I think branded is one of those decks I think should actually have a very solid shot being like one of the top 3 decks, if not the best deck of the format right now. And of course, in terms of its end board against all of these decks, I think the branded deck has like enough like layer interruptions, even though branded's interruptions are not necessarily as like much as a deck like, for example, Doomsday. I think one of Brandon's biggest strengths is that it just really needs to survive until the next turn. If it's able to do that, and it's probably just able to outgrind and reestablish his board well enough to beat any of these decks here. So at a high level, I would say it's going first and going second game plan is probably good enough into the format that we have at the moment. Once again, I'll be taking a look at the common non-engine that we have in the format and seeing how Brandon fares against them. I'll say against like the Charmies like Fua, it can be kind of scary for them if they're not able to set up a bigger board, because their half board, it may not be enough to in terms of interrupting the opponent and trying to hold them off from OTKing you. While there is counterplay, I think it can be a bit of a problem, but not enough of a problem to really make it right off the deck. Against the lower impact hand draws like Valor, may be potentially problematic depending on the hand of Branded. It's a little bit more effective into a deck like Branded than something like Doomsday. So again, not backbreaking, but something to keep in mind. Branded also has one very specific choke point where cards like Ogre and Harmonia are going to be good against, that being Albaz and the Synchro Cliche. These two can potentially be kind of backbreaking against the deck, because unlike a deck like Doomsday where it has sort of that redundancy of like having 3 effects to rank up in one turn, well, Brandon only is able to use Albaz once a turn. It's only able to use Cliche once a turn, and sometimes you're not even able to use both in the same turn. And so cards like Ogre and Harmonia can be a bit of a problem. That makes me kind of think, okay, maybe my initial assessment of its matchup into Cool Tune may not be as good, because maybe engine to engine, Brandon is a little bit better, but Cool Tune's non-engine does maybe swings the matchup back into Cool Tune's favor. So that's something to keep in mind. Like, yeah, it's not gonna like outright like shut down the deck and make it unplayable. But in that matchup, maybe that just means if I'm choosing to play Branded, I need to consider my deck building choices a little bit more carefully for that matchup, which is something I'll go over in the next part of this series. Once you've chosen a deck, like how to actually build it and have it do well in the format overall. Finally, against more niche hand traps like Bell, I think Bell's like fairly effective against Branded. It can be pretty scary for them. So once again, similar to Valor, not backbreaking, but something to keep in mind that like against these hand trap decks. Now in terms of common non-engine, Super Poly is probably like fine into the deck. I wouldn't say Super Poly is terrible into Branded. I wouldn't say it's like great into Branded. It's like alright. It really depends on the targets that people are playing their extra deck. I think outside of like the mirror match, Super Poly against Branded is probably not going to be super scary as the Branded player. Like Forbidden Crown, I think is also one of those cards that is like okay. It could potentially be kind of scary against Branded, because one of their main interruptions is using Fallen of Albaz to fuse the opponent's monster away on their turn. And this card is once again an answer like Ogre and Harmonia to it, so it's just something to keep in mind. Book of Eclipse also can potentially be pretty scary against the Branded deck as well, depending on how they set up their end board, but it shouldn't be an auto loss card. Dark Ruler, not super great against Branded, so not really a card you have to worry too much about. So overall, at a high level, I would say in terms of how Branded matches up into the non-engine, there are a few pieces of non-engine that can be kind of scary, but I would say none of these cards are so backbreaking to where like if your opponent sees like one of them, you're just auto losing the game. And so overall, I would say that Branded has a good enough matchup into the non-engine of the format. And so I would at this point conclude that, okay, Branded does also seem like a fairly viable deck. And then I would move on to the next step of my process, which would be to actually think about how to build the deck. Alright, so that's going to wrap up this video. I know it was a bit of a longer one, and it was different than the style of video that I usually put out. So let me know what you thought about this type of video in the comments below. Did you like it? Did you dislike it? Was there anything you think should be done differently for the next part of the series? I'm curious to hear what you think. Also want to give a quick update for my channel, because I have been away for a few weeks now. I was on vacation. And I think in the near future, for like the next upcoming couple of months, I still plan to upload videos, but it may not be on the same schedule that I had before. Might upload just once a week, maybe once every 2 weeks. I will be starting my new job soon, so may have less time to do things like this. But at least for the near foreseeable future, I do still plan to upload. It just may be less consistent. And if for the foreseeable future, I'm going to be mainly focusing on this series, because that's kind of the process that I'm actually going through right now when I'm starting to get into this format and prepare for upcoming events like YCS Montreal. So that's going to do it for this video. Hope you guys enjoyed and were able to get something useful out of it. If you enjoyed this type of content, make sure to subscribe. It really helps the channel out, and I really appreciate it. And it really helps me grow as a content creator, keeps me motivated to keep posting more videos like this as well. So with all that being said, thank you all so much for watching, and I will see you guys in the next one.